Israel is doing something so extraordinary that it has left the world in disbelief. Within just 1 year, more than 20 million fish were released into the heart of the arid Negev Desert. It is hard to believe that nearly 60% of this land is covered by sand. Summer temperatures often exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and rainfall is so scarce that long-term agriculture has been nearly impossible here for thousands of years. In such a harsh environment, fresh water is even rarer than arable land, and aquaculture was once considered completely impossible. Yet today, tropical fish raised in this very desert are appearing in European supermarkets, directly competing with wild-caught ocean fish. What makes this story remarkable is not that Israel transported fresh water into the Negev or built massive artificial oases. Instead, they rely very little on expensive desalination systems, choosing a completely different approach. So what transformed this scorching desert into a thriving sea of fish? Join Mandarin Tech as we explore how. Amid scorching stretches of sand and relentless dry winds, the Negev was more than just a desert. For the young state of Israel at that time, it represented a question of national survival. The most important issue was not economic development, but something far simpler: how to survive. In the 1950s, David Ben-Gurion, widely regarded as the founding father of Israel, proposed a vision that many considered unrealistic. The future of the country would be decided in the Negev. He believed Israel could not rely forever on the limited fertile lands in the north. This region covered more than half of the nation's territory, and if it could not sustain human life, Israel's long-term future would remain fragile. But reality proved extremely harsh. Summer temperatures often exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. Surface water was almost non-existent, and seasonal rivers appeared only briefly before disappearing beneath the hot desert sand. The first solution seemed obvious: transport water from the north to the south through a national water conveyance system. Hundreds of kilometers of pipelines and high-pressure pumping stations were designed to carry water from the Sea of Galilee to the southern desert. However, this ambition soon faced two major obstacles: geopolitical tensions surrounding Middle Eastern water resources and enormous costs caused by the harsh geology of the Negev, making the project nearly impossible to sustain. At that moment, an unexpected geological discovery completely changed how people viewed the Negev. In 1973, geologist Irai Izar and his research team began surveying the deep geological structure beneath the desert. When the drill penetrated ancient sandstone layers at a depth of about 2,300 feet, they unexpectedly struck water, not just the rare droplets typically found in deserts. When the drill was pulled back, water burst straight out of the ground under powerful natural pressure, forming a flowing artesian well powered entirely by energy compressed deep underground for tens of thousands of years. Scientists quickly identified it as fossil water. Ancient rainwater formed during the Ice Age, when the Sahara was once a lush grassland. For 20,000 to 40,000 years, this water had been trapped within porous rock layers under enormous pressure. The discovery revealed a remarkable truth. The Negev was not dry, it was simply hiding its water. This water belongs to the Nubian Aquifer, a vast underground water system stretching beneath Egypt, Libya, Chad, and Sudan, covering more than 770,000 square miles and containing enough water to fill Lake Superior nearly 40 times. Israel's territory lies only along the northern edge of this immense system. In other words, Israel had just discovered an ancient ocean sleeping beneath the desert. At that moment, many believed the dream of making the desert bloom had finally become reality. But that hope lasted only a short time. The water truly existed, yet it was almost impossible to use in the way people had imagined. At a depth of 2,300 feet, geothermal energy kept the water at temperatures between 99 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly the same as human body temperature. When brought to the surface, the heat shocked plant roots and disrupted the balance of cultivated soil, and that was still not the biggest obstacle. After tens of thousands of years dissolving minerals from surrounding rock, the water carried a salinity of about 3,000 parts per million, only 1/10 the salinity of seawater, but enough to damage most commercial crops. Agricultural trials quickly revealed the severity of the problem. Within just a few days of experimental irrigation, plants began reacting to the salt content. Leaves gradually turned yellow and growth rates slowed. Soon after, the entire test field nearly stopped developing and died within 2 weeks. Israel's Ministry of Agriculture concluded that the water could not be used for irrigation. The most reasonable solution seemed to be sealing the wells and abandoning the agricultural dream in the Negev. But at the very moment when failure seemed inevitable, a crucial question emerged. If the water was too salty for farming, why didn't Israel, a global leader in desalination technology, simply turn it into fresh water? Technically, Israel was fully capable of desalinating this water source. But engineers soon realized an unexpected truth. Desalination was actually the worst possible option. Modern desalination mainly relies on reverse osmosis technology, or RO, forcing water through ultrafine membranes under extremely high pressure to remove salt. The process works very efficiently for urban drinking water, where demand is controlled and the value of use is high. Agriculture, however, is an entirely different story. A single hectare of farmland can consume enormous volumes of water each year. Supplying desalinated water on an agricultural scale would require continuous operation, massive energy consumption, high-pressure pumping, and constant maintenance costs. As a result, agricultural production costs would soar, making the crops nearly impossible to compete with on the international market. And the problem did not end with cost. Desalination also produces brine, wastewater with extremely high salt concentration. In coastal plants, brine can be diluted and discharged into the ocean. But in the Negev Desert, where there is no sea to dilute the mistake, managing this salty waste became nearly unsolvable. Discharging it directly onto land would destroy microorganisms, degrade soil structure, and cause long-term damage to an already fragile ecosystem. For years, the central question had been, how can salt water be turned into fresh water? Then a bold idea emerged. Perhaps the desert had never been the problem. If this water could not sustain crops, then what kind of life was it waiting to sustain? The answer arrived in a way no one expected. When scientists placed the Negev water source onto the global ecological map, an almost unbelievable coincidence began to emerge. This water was neither seawater nor freshwater. With salinity at only about 1/10 that of the ocean and a naturally stable warm temperature, it unintentionally recreated conditions nearly identical to a familiar ecosystem on Earth. These were tropical estuaries, environments where freshwater and seawater constantly mix. In such habitats, terrestrial crops can barely survive, yet many aquatic species thrive and reach high economic value. The idea gradually became clearer. Instead of forcing the desert to become farmland, why not take advantage of the natural conditions the Negev already possessed? Biological comparisons soon led researchers beyond the Middle East, toward the warm estuaries of Australia and Southeast Asia, regions home to fish species that had evolved to live in warm brackish water almost identical to the hidden waters beneath the desert. And then they discovered a creature that seemed almost evolved specifically for those conditions. Barramundi, an Asian sea-based species, has survived for millions of years in fluctuating brackish environments. In the wild, barramundi spawn in salty coastal waters before migrating into warm rivers to grow. Their ability to tolerate constantly changing salinity and stable high temperatures made them a species seemingly designed for the Negev. In Europe or North America, farming barramundi typically involves enormous costs. Every winter, aquaculture facilities must heat their water for months to maintain temperatures between 79 and 93 degrees Fahrenheit, consuming vast amounts of electricity and fuel. But in the Negev Desert, what others must pay to create already existed naturally. The groundwater pumped to the surface was already warm, stable, and mineral-rich, turning fish ponds into a kind of eternal summer. What had once been considered the desert's greatest disadvantage, extreme heat, suddenly became a source of free energy. For the first time in modern history, the Negev was no longer a desert to be conquered, but an ocean waiting to be explored in an entirely new way. However, barramundi was not the only option. As early trials produced promising results, Israeli scientists quickly expanded to farming tilapia and European sea bass, species known for their salt tolerance, rapid growth, and strong adaptability to the warm brackish water naturally found beneath the Negev Desert. Beginning in the early 2000s, the first fish farms started to appear in areas once defined only by sand and rock. Large aquaculture ponds and industrial-scale concrete tanks were built in succession, transforming land once considered worthless into new food production zones. Ancient groundwater was continuously pumped from depths of more than 2,000 feet to the surface, then aerated and stabilized before hundreds of thousands of juvenile fish were introduced into each pond. The results came faster than expected. The fish required little adaptation time and began growing steadily almost immediately. High survival rates and uniform growth demonstrated that the Negev was not an artificial environment forcing life to exist, but rather a naturally compatible ecosystem that had always been there. Within just a few years, small experimental farms expanded into a fully developed industry. By the late 2000s, fish production in the Negev exceeded 3,000 tons annually, with most of it exported to Europe. Fish raised in the desert began appearing in supermarkets across France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, competing directly with ocean-caught seafood thanks to consistent quality and year-round supply. The success of desert fish farming quickly brought a problem that every intensive aquaculture system in the world eventually faces. But in the Negev, it became far more dangerous. A single barramundi consumes about 3% of its body weight in food each day. When a single pond holds up to 100,000 fish, the amount of feed entering the system daily becomes enormous. And what the fish do not absorb does not simply disappear. It is broken down by bacteria and converted into ammonia, a silent toxin that gradually accumulates in the water. Once ammonia levels exceed 2 parts per million, fish gills begin to suffer damage. Respiratory capacity declines, and the nervous system is affected. No disease or natural disaster is required. The farming environment itself can kill the entire stock within a short time. The ponds quite literally begin to poison themselves. In traditional aquaculture, this problem is usually solved through technology. Massive mechanical and biological filtration systems are installed to remove waste and continuously recirculate water. They are effective, but consume electricity equivalent to dozens of households and drive annual operating costs into the tens of thousands of dollars. Another option is to discharge wastewater into the ocean, allowing the sea to dilute pollution in exchange for sustaining the fish stock. But the Negev has no ocean, and more importantly, the desert has no water to waste. While fish tanks were gradually suffocating under the accumulation of waste, not far away, the olive groves and date palm fields of the Negev were lacking the very resource the desert struggled with most: nutrients. This contrast led to an idea that seemed simple yet revolutionary. Researchers at Ben Gurion University asked an unusual question: if waste was poisoning the fish, could it become a resource for crops? Instead of filtering or discharging wastewater through energy-intensive systems, they built a network that directed water straight from the fish ponds to agricultural fields. After each farming cycle, the water had naturally cooled, but still carried nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, exactly the nutrients desert soil lacked. As it flowed through plant root zones, the soil acted as a massive biological filter, absorbing nutrients while simultaneously purifying the water without the need for treatment plants. The results were quickly surprising. Olive yields increased by 15 to 20%, trees grew faster, and oil content rose significantly. Date palms produced larger, sweeter fruit and soon became high-value export crops. Remarkably, salt, once considered agriculture's greatest enemy, did not destroy the system. Olive and date trees can tolerate salinity levels up to 5,000 parts per million, while water from the fish ponds measured only about 3,000 parts per million. In fact, mild salt stress even stimulated plants to accumulate sugars and essential oils, enhancing flavor intensity. In Israel, fresh water has always been an expensive resource. On average, 35 cubic feet of water costs about 60 to 70 cents. A farm covering just 2.5 acres can consume up to 88 million gallons of water per year, equivalent to roughly $7,000 in irrigation costs alone. A figure high enough to make many desert farming models economically unviable. But brackish water from the Nubian aquifer completely changed the economic equation. Extraction costs are only about 5 to 10 cents for the same volume of water, nearly 90% cheaper than desalinated fresh water or water transported from the north. The genius of the Negev system lies not in finding cheap water, but in using water twice. Fish farms cover the costs of pumping and operating the system. After the aquaculture cycle, nutrient-rich water flows onward to olive and date plantations, where farmers effectively receive irrigation water and fertilizer at almost no cost while eliminating wastewater treatment expenses. Two industries that once competed fiercely for water have now become a symbiotic ecosystem. Today, the Negev produces more than 3,000 tons of fish annually, with barramundi and tilapia exported to European markets. More importantly, the economic value generated per cubic meter of water is many times higher than that of traditional agriculture, a metric increasingly seen by arid nations as a measure of survival in the 21st century. In one of the driest deserts on Earth, Israel has achieved what once seemed impossible, raising millions of fish using water that was once considered useless. Instead of fighting nature, they turned heat into energy, brackish water into a living habitat, and waste into a resource. The Negev Desert fish are not just an agricultural success, but proof that innovation begins when humans learn to work with nature. Like and follow Mandarin Tech to discover more remarkable technology stories like this.